Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Historical Gamer again today for the wargamer.com. And today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. It's kind of a review, kind of a discussion. And what it's going to be is if you take a look at a calendar here, you might be able to guess the significance of today. It's the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Marne. And I'm going to be doing I don't know if it's really a review, maybe more of a discussion about a game that's not all that old. It came out a couple of months ago. It's called Valiant Hearts. It's published by Ubisoft. It's part of the UbiArt engine, if you will, which was designed to kind of be a little bit more artistic in terms of the way that this 2D platform engine is presented. As I said, it's a 2D platformer, and it focuses on the First World War, so I figured why not take a look at it on the 100th anniversary of one of the most pivotal battles of the 20th century. And it's a little bit different than what a lot of the types of games you're going to see on the wargamer.com, but that's why I wanted to talk about it, because I think there's a lot there. You might be someone who's into war games and into, all the kind of nitty-gritty and grogging it out, if you will. At the same time, I think this game has an interesting appeal to both people who might be more interested in mainstream platform games and also people who are more interested in war games. There's so much to it, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So without further ado, let's jump into it. What is Valiant Hearts? Valiant Hearts is a 2D side-scrolling puzzle platformer. That's about all you need to know about the gameplay mechanics. Essentially, the levels consist of you running around and solving difficult puzzles by moving things and or reassembling obstacles in the right places, or just pulling heavy ropes or whatever else in the right order, putting them in the right places, and basically solving puzzles while attempting to avoid getting yourself killed by the enemy. What makes the gameplay special, however, is the ambiance. The player in Valiant Hearts might be a glorified puzzle solver, but the obstacles and puzzles are all located throughout a brilliantly designed level system that shows off World War I in a new way, a way that, while it touches on the bloody stalemates of the Western Front, also shows a surprising variety of types of combat and basically just different types of fighting and different things going on throughout World War I, far beyond just the simple bloody trench line that's usually pushed by most of history today. From the open field battles of the frontiers in the Marne, to the fortresses at Verdun, the horrors of gas warfare at Ypres, the massacre at the Somme, the home front behind German lines, the game even delves into the unique tunnel and mine wars at Messines, and the slaughter of Chem des Dames. Pardon my pronunciations, I definitely am not going to get the majority of this right. But what I'm getting at is never before in a World War I game has a game been able to capture the sheer amount of variety and experiences faced by the soldiers of the First World War, and done so in an authentic and compelling way, which I've never seen even come close to seeing before, from a personal perspective of what individual soldiers were going through. Part of what really makes this game shine and makes it feel authentic and unique is the way in which achievements and Easter eggs are handled in the game. That's because while a key part of many puzzle platformers is their achievements and collectibles elements to the game, Valiant Hearts approaches these items in a unique and educational way. Instead of random trinkets and odds and ends, Valiant Hearts seeks to use the Easter eggs as a way to teach the player about the First World War, in a way in which all World War I enthusiasts and all new players to the game can appreciate and can learn from. Essentially, as you move through the levels, you can collect various artifacts, which will show up randomly along your way. Some are easy to find and some are difficult. These Easter eggs, if you will, all have a write-up about them, so when you pick them up, you can read a little bit about them, and they're tailored to the specific level you're playing in. So if you go through boot camp, you might find a button from a uniform, or you might find a item that would be used commonly throughout training. As you move through the trenches, you might find trench carvings that were made by soldiers during the war. On the gas level, you might find primitive attempts at making gas masks, the first ones covered in urine with a cloth. The list of loot and Easter eggs, or whatever you want to call them, is very extensive and informative. In addition to just having these artifacts and tailoring them well to the particular battle you're fighting, the brief write-ups really add an element of immersion to the game. The part that really blew me away, however, was finding real letters written by real soldiers, which are also scattered throughout the battlefields. These too are tailored for the specific battles in which you're fighting, so if you're in the middle of the Battle of the Somme, you would end up seeing a letter from a soldier who actually fought in the Battle of the Somme. The same would go for Verdun and various other engagements in which you fight in. And they really give you a personal connection to this game that, again, is something I think is extremely rare these days, incredibly artistic and incredibly well done. These real historical sources thrown in addition to the educational loot or Easter eggs that you find along the way, makes it feel more like you're walking through a museum exhibit rather than playing a game. And as ambitious as this particular project was, it would have been easy to bungle the execution and make it feel cumbersome or boring, but I think the way in which the game brings the artifacts and the letters and everything that you find along the way into the game is very well done and really doesn't take away from the game. If you don't want to play the game to learn, you don't have to, but there is that option. And I think in that sense, the game does a great service to those who, let's face it, this is an Ubisoft game. This is something that's going to be well known out there and has decent marketing behind it for a game of this kind. So to have that ability and that option there to educate people, I think is absolutely wonderful. And at the same time, it doesn't get boring for grogs, because you might not be a newbie to the First World War, but there's a lot of things in there that you might find as loot that I guess I never really realized. Meanwhile, as you kind of slug through it, it kind of gives you the feeling of being a soldier in there and kind of imagining what things would be like to be, basically to finding entertainment from carving a statue in wood while you sit in a trench line or something along those lines. The emotional tie that you feel to the individual soldier and to the experience in which you're going through is that initial emotional hook, which was attempted to be continued through the game's character design. Valiant Hearts has 4 main characters. Karl, a German who's deported at the very beginning of the game, whose fiancée or wife is a French citizen and who lives in France, but is deported just at the start of kind of tensions going the direction of war when France knows that war is about to erupt. Emile, who is the father of Marie, who's Karl's wife, he enlists in the French army. Freddy, who's an American in France and kind of has it's a story that's an attempt to bring in the American audience and make them feel involved and interested in the game, despite the fact that the United States is really more or less uninvolved for the vast majority of the story. Nonetheless, you're marketing your story to Americans. You probably want an American in there, so they kind of tie off of or pull off of some rather incredibly unlikely sources to bring an American into the fold. There were something like 200 Americans who volunteered to partake in the French army in the early days of the war, and Freddy is just one of such an incredibly small amount of people that the likelihood of him being there is incredibly small, yet nonetheless, he's there, and there is some historical backing for his involvement in the story. And then you've got Anna, who's a Parisian nurse who plays kind of the non-combatant role in this series, in which you kind of use her as you travel around during her scenes, acting as a nurse trying to heal soldiers on both sides of the lines, healing both Frenchmen and Germans as well. You've also got a kind of half-player-controlled dog. I'm not sure what his name is. I've been looking through here trying to figure it out. I guess maybe there isn't a name. Maybe it's Fritz. I'm not sure. I thought I heard somewhere that its name is Fritz, but I could be way off on that. I've played through the game a couple of times and I don't remember it really coming up. But anyway, it's a dog that gives you you can control it in certain parts. It kind of acts as another tool for you to get through some of the puzzles, and is another one of those things that tries to draw you in and give you kind of an emotional attachment to the game. And these 4 characters all come together throughout the story in different ways, so that they're all sort of trying to go their own ways through the war and trying to survive through the war. And the game really tries to make you feel attached to the characters and emotionally invested in the characters, and kind of makes you you're trying to pull for the characters to get through the war, and there's different incidences that come up that may endanger their lives. You may think they're dead on more than one occasion, and it's one of those things where they're trying to emotionally invest you in the characters to make you feel almost in an anti-war mindset. The character design is pretty well done, with the exception of Freddy's kind of questionable involvement in the storyline. Essentially, the plot starts with, obviously Carl is taken out of France. He ends up joining the German military, and gives you a sense of kind of there being, both sides being somewhat innocent, and both sides being somewhat both victims of this horrible conflict. And I would say the strength of the game and the message of the game being very anti-war in general is pretty much the strongest part of this game. Rarely do you see a war game such as Valiant Hearts where you almost never even touch the enemy in a harmful manner, and it's interesting to look at. I wouldn't say there's a whole lot of violence in most war games, oddly enough. You think about it. There's games out there like Scourge of War where you certainly see enemy getting killed. It's on much more macro level, I would say, than something like Valiant Hearts, which is a much more personal look. And then if you go kind of the direction of more traditional war games even, and less mainstream war games, you've got things like War in the Pacific, you've got things like Command, Modern Air Naval Combat, or I believe that's the name of Command. And these games are games in which you never even see an enemy soldier. You just see some kind of hex on the screen, and they represent thousands or individual soldiers or whatnot. But rarely do you actually see an enemy on the screen. The very few games today that do portray war in kind of a more personal level are really not war games at all. They're traditional kind of first-person shooters, which glorify combat and glorify warfare. Something that I think most wargamers probably would abhor, because a lot of wargamers, at least some of them anyway, have personal experience in combat. And I think in general, very few people are going to glorify war and say it's the greatest thing. But it seems to be much more common in kind of the cartoony, unrealistic first-person shooter crowd than it does in the more traditional wargaming crowd. And I think that's a strength of Valiant Hearts, because it definitely kind of demonizes conflict and makes everyone out to be the victims of this, with one exception, and that being Baron von Dorf. Now, Baron von Dorf in Valiant Hearts is kind of the chief antagonist, and he represents essentially kind of the villain of the game. And that's something that I think is a little bit, to me, that's the thing that bothers me the most about this game. This game does a brilliant job of setting this atmosphere of this horrible conflict. It does a brilliant job of making you feel for both sides. Not only is Carl a German citizen and a German soldier, and yet he's one of your player-controlled characters as well as controlling characters on the French side, but there's a few instances where you run into the whole live and let live scenario, where soldiers from both sides come together and agree essentially not to harm each other, but just to try and get out of a horrible situation that both sides are stuck in without shooting or killing each other. There's a couple of situations like that come up in the game, and is actually accurate, especially to the early war mindset that a lot of the soldiers found themselves in. And if you read about World War I, you can learn more about those sort of live and let live scenarios. But Baron von Dorf represents, I think, all that's bad about this game. There's a lot of great stuff with the game. I think mainly, to me, what impresses me most is the attention to detail, that level of education that's provided by the Easter eggs, as I've been calling them, and just the sort of the artistic feel, the anti-war feel, and that authentic feel with all these historical documents and educational pieces, as well as well-done characters, well-done music, well-done pacing, well-done level design. The thing that really bothers me is the inclusion of Baron von Dorf in this game. And that's because von Dorf is a cartoony, evil, villainous German character who seems to only have his existence in this game to play up things that I guess maybe more mainstream gaming is used to. Well, we've got to have a villain in this game. There's no conflict without it, which I think is wrong. The whole trying to get through and survive through the First World War is conflict in of itself. But I know why they did it. I think it's an appeal to the more mainstream base of, we need to have a chief villain to kind of help drive this story through the first 3 quarters of the game or so.
And I think it's the way that they portray him as being this sort of cartoony, outlandish German commander is a way to lighten the mood, perhaps, rather than having this be a mature game per se, in that it's, appealing to very heavy-handed, very serious topics throughout. It's a way to kind of lighten the mood as you get through the game. But to me, it was just a little bit too cartoony, a little bit too fake, and kind of took away the element of trying to play up both sides as being victims in this conflict.
And maybe I'm being a little bit too critical, because, as you can obviously see here with the footage, it is a pretty cartoony-looking game. It's not something that feels too deep and nitty-gritty. And when I say that the game really plays up the experiences, it's kind of the things you see your character going through, but you don't really feel it. You definitely have an emotional attachment to your characters, as I've already said, but it's not... I wouldn't say it's, you feel exactly what they're going through either. It's not a realistic World War I shooter or RPG that's trying to make you feel like you're in the trenches, but it is trying to educate you about the experiences that the soldiers had to go through and what you had to deal with on a daily basis. So again, I recognize that the game is pretty cartoony. It is pretty silly at times, but that is with, the understanding of kind of where the game's message is that, the horror of war is real and palpable, and these are the types of things that soldiers had to deal with. And I think the game already does a good job in lightening the atmosphere by having a kind of cartoony feel to a lot of it, and that I feel like having Baron von Dorf there, is just kind of an unnecessary extravagance that really takes away from the whole kind of joint message of it being horrible for all sides, because that really is the message that you take away from this game. It's not that the Germans are evil, it's that it was horrible for everyone involved. And it does so in a kind of cartoony way. I think of the comic strip Mouse, which kind of touches on the Holocaust and does so through a comic, and is absolutely horrible and horrific, and much more serious than this game. But it lightens the mood somewhat by being in the form of a comic, and I think this game does the same thing, and to me, Baron von Dorf just takes away from that. It's an unnecessary element. You could have found another way to propel the story forward, still kept things a little bit silly, still kept things a little bit lighthearted, while also still kept your message the same, and that's my biggest criticism of the game.
I don't have a whole lot else to say with the game. I think the main things that I take away from this game is the absolutely perfect atmosphere that's set throughout a lot of it, the amazing pacing, the amazing attention to detail, the ability to make educational pieces in the game fun, interesting, all-inclusive, something that I think a war gamer can get a lot out of, something that I think someone who doesn't know a whole lot about World War I can learn a lot from this game. And I think this is really kind of that entry, I think, into World War I and into history and into learning that I think gaming can be. I'm not someone who's out there saying that gaming needs to be educational at all times, because gaming's a release. Gaming's something that we do to kill time. But I do think that there's an element there and something there that can be used to teach as well as to have fun. And I think this game blends both really well. I think it draws you in really well. I think it makes you feel like you're a part of it very well. It makes you feel attached and makes you sympathize with what soldiers went through 100 years ago in one of the most horrific conflicts of modern times. And yet, I think it's undone somewhat by the just rubber stamping on this villain who's evil, well, as best as I can tell, who's evil because he's German.
If the underlying message of this game, as best as I can tell, is that it, to be humanist and kind of sympathize with the soldiers, I don't think you need to include the type of villain that they have in Von Dorf. And I think the game has enough comedic relief to stop from being too serious and too heavy-handed with the experiences already in kind of that cartoony comic strip style design, without having to resort to cheap gimmicks and just the status quo of the villain being German because, well, he's German.
So aside from the Von Dorf part, I think this is a great game. I think it's like $14 or something like that on Steam or on PlayStation 4. It's available on every console. I think the atmosphere is great. The music's great. Even if you're not really a mainstream gamer, if you're more niche-like, or if you're not a huge platformer, I think it's worth the pickup. If it's not something you want to pay the full price, then when it comes on sale at some point on Steam, definitely check it out, because it's an experience, I think. More so than just a game. And me personally, I loved it. I barely play any platform games. Lately, I've really only been playing mostly war games, with a few exceptions, a few sport games that I enjoy. And this was an absolute treat. I bought it actually when it first came out several months ago. I approached Nick, the editor at Wargamer, asked if I could do something on it because, to me it was something special, something rare, especially something put out by a company like Ubisoft, and I thought it was something that deserved a little bit more attention. It got plenty of attention in the mainstream, but not a whole lot of attention, I would say, within the wargaming community. I've seen a lot of people comment on it, but I think it's also one of those games that probably will slide under the radar a lot from a lot of wargamers just because it's not the traditional type of game that they would purchase. And I personally... I generally get away from rating games or recommending games. If you can stomach the whole Von Dorf junk that really focuses a lot of the effort in the first part of the game, and you can appreciate everything else that's in this game, and especially the ending to this game, I think it's really something that's a must-buy for anyone interested in history, anyone interested in war games, anyone interested in platformers, and anyone who might not even be interested in those things. It's really a work of art, and I was impressed by it. But that's enough of me rambling here. That's going to just about do it here for this game. Again, I didn't touch on everything. I just, wanted to touch on a few things that I thought were really impressive and important, and, one thing that kind of bugged me about the game. But let me know if you like this. Throw comments in the Wargamer forum or, in the video here. Let me know what you think. Let me know if this is something you enjoyed. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.